Over a year ago, chess.com ranked their best moves for black against e4 and d4. Let's do it for knight f3, which I actually played. The worst move against knight f3 is 1g5, which loses a pawn immediately. Well, now you can control the center completely, and the bishop developing over here doesn't really make much sense because you could have just played g6 and not lost the pawn instead. Of course, if you play f6 trying to build the center, e4 allows you to checkmate your opponent. So there is no real reason to play this. g5 is the worst move. The Herstrom Gambit should not be played. The next move is f6. Now, Feingold's golden rule is not to play f6 or f3 in any position, and while that's not completely true, here it doesn't really make much sense either. While you are restricting the knight from coming forward, we weren't going to move the knight there anyway, and this just weakens the diagonal towards your king. We can just play e4, and if your opponent is unlucky enough to play e5, then you've got a really great trap where you just immediately win the game by sacrificing your knight. The Damiano defense can stem from this, but really f6 doesn't do very much in its own right. g5, trying to... It's laughable. So f6 is not a good move, don't play it. Next we're going to talk about some moves that allow you to counter-strike in the center. These moves just don't really appear to do anything, and in some positions even weaken their position. a5 doesn't really make very much sense. Now this square is weak, and a5, gaining some space on the queen side, is just inferior to just playing e4 or d4 for white, who actually does gain full control of the center. Fantastic. This move is going in bottom tier. We really can't talk about it for very much. h5 is not very good. Now on the opposite side of it, wait, no, it was a5. On the opposite side, h5 is not very good either, because this move now weakens the king's side. And in the future, this could potentially be a hook to launch some sort of kingside attack. But really, what are the ideas behind h5 anyway? To keep advancing the pawn? Well, this doesn't make very much sense. And you can just respond by playing like e4 and controlling the center. So h5 goes in the bottom tier. The next move we're going to talk about is the move knight a6, developing the knight to the wrong side of the board. So there's a reason you don't want to put your knight on the edge of the board, notably because it diminishes the amount of squares that it can actually go to. And of the squares that this knight can go to that are forward, we can just take them away with our pawns, and that would be a tempo game. So it doesn't make sense to develop the knight here. It belongs in the bottom tier. Don't do this. The next move that we're going to talk about is kind of the cousin of knight a6, which is knight h6. Now I'd say this move is a little bit better, because it prepares for you to castle kingside, but again, this is just inferior to knight f6. So why would you ever play this move? There is no reason for it to go to the corner of the board this early on. So knight h6 is going in the bottom tier. Then we have some waiting moves that aren't super great either. a6 takes away the b5 square, admittedly, but that isn't super amazing, because now we just play e4 and control the center. Or we can play d4 or c4 and control the center anyway. The bishop is coming out here, and there's not really a good way to stop it. Now if you play b5, then suddenly, you can play a4 and start undermining the center. a6 is not very good, but especially it's not very good as your first move. So a6, St. George's defense, is going in the bottom tier. Now the next move we're going to talk about is the cousin of a6, which is h6. Now of course this does stop the knight from moving forward to g5, but at the same time, it's a bit too early to be doing that. Again, take full control of the center, and h6 seems like a wasted move, especially if they play h5 later. Just a complete waste, so bottom tier, don't play this move. With all of that out of the way, these moves are kind of garbage against the vast majority of moves in general, and knight f3 is no different. We're going to move on to the moves that are actually okay, and that you could consider playing them, but I wouldn't recommend it because they have their own faults. First, we're going to talk about b5, the Polish defense. This gain space on the queen side will immediately prepare the fianchetto with the light square bishop. And this can be okay, I mean, it is easy to get a tempo on the pawn with playing something like e4, but the bishop does counterattack the pawn. So if you're willing to trade the b pawn for the e pawn, then we can promise you a large leading development. Here, you can castle, right? They'll play c6, kicking the bishop back to e2, e5, going forward, knight c3, attacking the bishop, and so on and so forth. There is some legitimate merit to be found here, especially since c6 and d5 do make a sturdy center, but this move is also not very great because white just has a tremendous leading development that's about to keep on expanding. So b5, not unplayable, has its benefits. Wouldn't recommend it because it's just a complete violation of all chess principles and leads to a position that's really hard to play. So b5 to Polish defense is going into it's okay defense. The next one we're going to talk about is the cousin of b5, and that's b6, the Queen's Fiend Kettle. Now, this move isn't super bad, it doesn't hang a pawn or anything, but the problem here is just that the Owen's defense, which is e4 and then b6, is pretty good for white. So that doesn't change anything if you just reverse the move order and just play knight f3 first. Right? You could still play knight c3, right? And then e6, and then d4, and then bishop here, right? And then bishop here, and then d5, and etc., etc. Negi wrote a pretty great book on this, so it isn't fully necessary for me to discuss the theory here. Suffice it to say, this is not an amazing position for black because it's pretty easy to cramp the position with e5 eventually. I wouldn't call this a horrible position. In many cases, people just blunder to e-pawn early on. But if you're talking about actually, like, theoretically sound openings, this is far from the best. So it's going into it's okay. The next move we're going to talk about is knight c6, the Black Mustang defense. And this move is also okay. At first blush, it kind of looks pretty good because you're developing a knight towards the center. But what's the problem? The problem is that white hasn't committed to playing e4, which you would normally respond with playing e5, and then defending that pawn with the knight. So instead, what you can do is realize that in queen's pawn positions, you typically need the support of your c-pawn for both sides. And what has black done? They have blocked in their c-pawn by playing knight c6. d4 puts this line out of commission, in my opinion, because you would have to play d5, right? But then c4 is basically a superior Vienna gambit on the other side of the board, in which the queen's diagonal is open instead of the king's diagonal. And this position is just so tough for black to handle. It is a Chigorin defense, but if you're good at playing against the Chigorin, this just provides a massive benefit to you. So this line kind of puts it out of commission. But the one benefit preventing me from putting this anywhere lower is that if white doesn't play d4, which does happen, then knight c6 is a fantastic move. For example, against g3, right, you can play e5. And this is strange. You're not supposed to have full control of the center like this if you play strange opening, but it is true. You do get full control of the center. If you play e4, right, e5, and now you're in a classic king's pawn game. One of the best options against e4. So knight c6, if your opponent doesn't play d4, is pretty good. But if they do play d4, it's not very good. Okay, that takes us out of the it's okay tier, and we're going to start talking about some solid choices against knight f3. Specifically, we're going to start by talking about the King's Indian setups. 1d6 is the Peert's invitation, because if you play e4, this is the Peert's defense, or the Philidor, or the Sicilian. Now, 1d6 is fine, but I think it's an inferior way to enter the King's Indian, because you have to be prepared for the Peert's and the King's Indian properly. Right, knight f6 here, and now you play c4, or you play e4, knight f6, and then knight c3, g6, and then d4. These positions are completely different, even though they look similar. The Peert's and the King's Indian are quite different, and the Peert's actually has a far worse reputation than the King's Indian at higher level. Well, there is that. However, this position is still not horrible for black. And in fact, there's some serious counterplay that is brewing on all sides of the board here. Once black, of course, finishes their development. So I can't put this in anywhere lower than it's a solid choice, because if you do happen to play the Peert's and the King's Indian, well, d6 is one of the moves you can choose. And by that same logic, g6 is also very good for those types of players, because it's pretty much the same thing as playing 1d6. You play the Peert's, you play the King's Indian, you have to play both. And if you do, it's good. So 1g6 goes into solid choice. Now, we're also going to talk about the Dutch defense, f5. Of course, this is a move that weakens the king side, but in this case, you use it to gain space in the center of the board. And you are helped out by the fact that your opponent doesn't have access to immediately checking you on this diagonal, nor any truly great gambits to try and open up the center to expose the weakness of your king. And of course, when you play f5, you can get your traditional sort of Dutch setup, right, where your opponent plays the classical kind of variations of it, but you also have to deal with some theory that is exclusive to knight f3. For example, your opponent might play d3, right, and e4. Now, if you dot to take the pawn twice, and then after the bishop attacks to retreat the knight, suddenly black is lost in this position, which is crazy to say, but that's the power of known theory. And the fact that you have to learn some extra theory against Knight f3 specifically makes it so that Dutch players kind of forget about this, and it can lead to some trouble. And furthermore, the Dutch is super great because you can actually just gain full control of this part of the center, and this move proves to be a little bit too weakening. But again, at most levels, we're not going to really figure that out, so the Dutch defense goes into a solid choice. Next, we're going to talk about moves that are, strictly speaking, inferior to d5. c6 and e6. So, e6 is a move that just isn't very good if you don't play the French, right? Because your opponent can play e4 here, and, well, you either have to play c5, the Sicilian, or you have to play d5, the French. If you don't play either of these, you're going to be in for a very, very, very rough time, because these are not the most forgiving of openings if you just kind of don't know the theory. However, if you do play either the e6 Sicilians or the French, then this is a fantastic opening choice for you. You should play, in fact, 1e6. However, the other problem lies with the fact that you also have to be prepared against c4. Now, in these positions, you can either go b6, but really you should be playing d5 here to get the Queen's Gambit decline kind of setup. So, if you like playing the Queen's Gambit declined and one of those openings against e4, then e6 is a good choice for you. But again, I hold strongly that it just makes sense to go with d5 to begin with and then play e6 to eliminate the possibility of them playing e4. The same kind of logic applies to 1c6, because now your opponent can play e4, and if you're not a Caro player, then this is going to be a problem. Not that this is the most challenging setup, of course, but you still have to be prepared for 1e4, and then you have to be prepared against the Slav defenses, which requires another specific branch of theory. And mind you, it's easier to just cut down on the theoretical work you have to do if you just play d5, because e4 is just not a very good move here. It's at least a lot less theory to know in order to refute this move. That being said, these are solid moves, and they are pretty good in their own right. However, the fact that they force you to learn an e4 opening specific to them pretty much puts them in my opinion, the same category as d6 and g6, which do the same thing. Before we get to the top tier, I realized I forgot one of the openings, e5, the Ross Gambit. This move is probably the best move that belongs in the bad tier. So, has some reason behind it, but again, this move loses a pawn. Now, the benefit is that your queen and your bishop are opened up. You could potentially kick the knight back with e6 and then try to get some compensation for the pawn. However, it's just thoroughly not enough. There aren't any weaknesses in white's position, because the only thing you've done is just provoke the knight to move forward and backwards. Now, of course, you can play knight c6 and get some sort of strange staffed gambit, but this is just worse because white has not committed to playing e4. Lastly, you can try to get some sort of strange King's Indian setup, but the lack of the e-pawn makes it so difficult to challenge the center. Just, it's not worth it. However, one thing I should note is that there are a lot of players that don't actually capture the e-pawn. For whatever reason, they just choose not to. So if they don't and play something like e4, or d4, or c4, you're fine. You're probably more than fine in some of these cases. However, the fact that they could just take the pawn kind of throws this line out of commission. It's not very good. Okay, we're going to talk about the top 3 defenses. These are the only ones that I think belong to the top tier. I think we'll start with c5. This move is what I think to be solidly top 3, but in my opinion, number 3. Best openings against knight f3. The problem with c5, even though this is a fantastic option that denies the ability to play d4 without some serious concessions, it has some flaws in the fact that you have to know a couple of serious options. Now, of course, b3 is not super challenging, and the King's Indian is something you have to prepare against anyway, no matter what you play. So I would assume that those wouldn't be 2 major issues. But the problem is that white can play either c4 or e4. And that is a problem. The problem is that they're different, right? e4 is the Sicilian, open Sicilian, the most combative opening against e4. Tactical, sharp, something that positional players may struggle with the first couple of go-rounds. On the other hand, c4, the symmetrical English, one of the most solid possible choices against the English opening. and something that tactical players that have weaker strategic foundations might not like playing. And the fact is, you have to know both of these, right? I can play c4 here, I can play e4 here. That's the benefit of knight f3. So if you don't both play the Sicilian and the symmetrical English, you are going to struggle big time. However, both of those openings are pretty much the best there are. If you know how to play both the Sicilian and the symmetrical English, this is the opening for you. And there's not really much of a question about it. So c5 goes thoroughly into third place. Now, knight f6 and d5, right? Which are, in my opinion, the two most challenging moves against knight f6. Knight f3. So which one's going in second place? Controversial opinion. I'm putting knight f6 in second place. Knight f6 plays against the mentality of the knight f3 player. We play knight f3 because we want to wait to see what black does and then counter that accordingly. But knight f6 is the best waiting move. We don't have another waiting move. So now we have to show black what we plan to do. b3 or g3 or c4, d4, e4. What could we do? We have to show them first, and they get the opportunity to counter against us. Assuming that black has an opening against English, the regular queen's pawn game, the Nymphs Larsen attack, and the King's Indian defense, King's Indian attack, then they will have a weapon to deal with whatever we can throw at them. So the fact is, knight f6 puts a lot of pressure on us as a waiting move. However, there is one immediate downside of knight f6. And that downside is that it doesn't immediately claim the center, which means that unlike d5, knight f6 does not actually cramp our options all that much. We have so many things we can do. b3, c3, knight c3, d4, c4, e4, not e4, e3, g3. So many moves that you can possibly play. However, the fact that you have to show what you do makes knight f6 a really great move, which is fantastic because knight f6 is good no matter what we do, pretty much. However, I think the best opening against knight f3 is d5. And the reason is simple. It's because d5 clamps down tremendously on our options. You can go d4, you can go g3, and you can go b3. That's about it for all of the options that people are likely to play. The fact is, b3 is not super challenging. You can just play c5 and then knight c6, e5, and eventually the Nymphs Larsen attack kind of like runs out of steam. On the other hand, the King's Indian is not super horrible, but the fact that we play it this early, showing that we're playing the King's Indian, gives black the option to either take full control of the center or to support their pawn with c6, making it even more difficult for us to actually gain control over the king side, because it's not forcing the center to be closed by attacking a b-pawn that isn't defended by another pawn. And lastly, of course, you can play d4, but that just means you get into a standard Queen's Gambit setup. Heck, you can even play c5 here. And this is pretty okay for black. As for anything else you can do, you can play c4, like I do, but that allows your opponent to gain a tremendous amount of space with d4. And the Benoni is not super liked by most players. The fact that d5 claims control of the center and clamps down on our options, even if it doesn't force us to show our cards, is a huge problem and makes d5 the best move against knight f3. Now with good play, white is still better, but d5 remains supreme as the best move.